now the official part is over, so this is more social part. Also something that never can be governed entirely, so we don't know what will happen.
Do we have a chance to get out before midnight?
Yes.
Okay, good.
The audience could easily come closer to slightly balance the undemocratic way of us having an oval table down here and starting the discussion. So you're welcome to join us. It has been a fascinating day. For me at least, I hope for everybody else as well. We have had the brutal computation. We've had the swarm intelligence with design intentions. We've had atoms and bits. And in between, we have had everything else. So I'm really grateful, Anton, that you produced the word political. Because it started in the morning also with ideological. So just not to impose anything, but I would say 4 words only, and then try to open up the discussion. It is ideology, aesthetics, politics, and ethics. Not necessarily in that order, but closely connected always to architecture. We can't deny that there is digital. I dare not to say it reality, but surely I believe there is an autonomous digital reality, which, as we have understood today, fundamentally will change things. I believe also that. So, I would like to open up the discussion. What happens to architecture in this new world, looking at these 4 words that really connect humans to architecture and building? And I would in a way give floor to you guys who have been doing the keynotes to start with remarks and questions of each other, and then immediately I open up the discussion here as well, so we could go back to these questions and, well, ask the questions.
Okay. You first.
Okay. Okay, I'll start by ideology. Architects necessarily have to do with ideology if we define ideology as the number of ideas, etc., that we share in a given society and contribute to stabilize it for the better and for the worse. So architecture has evidently to do with ideology. Architecture has also to do with a disruption at the margin of ideology. And one of my arguments was to say that architecture was political, not only because it endorses ideology, but because it disrupts it slightly. So I've already done ideology and politics. What was the third? It was ethics and...
Aesthetics, that's between ideology and politics.
Aesthetics for me is a tricky question, actually, because I think aesthetics, I'm deeply interested in aesthetics, but I think aesthetics goes a step further than the beautiful as opposed to the ugly, or the ugly as the new beautiful, or whatever. Aesthetics is about meaningfulness. For me, the task of architecture is to suggest that this is a world in which the human have a place, which is not much, but is enormous. It creates a human arena. And the last term, I'll be provocative, I'm not sure architects are very ethical people. In the ordinary sense. You know, architects are ready to betray mother, father, and friends to get a building built. So we all know that they're a bit tricky in risk. But they have there again a kind of higher sense of ethics. Let me take an example from Le Corbusier. You know, there are a lot have been said about Le Corbusier being a fascist, etc. I think Le Corbusier was not a fascist. For a very simple reason. He was ready to build for whoever, Mussolini, the Soviet, you name it. Yeah, absolutely. But the Soviets, actually, the only big building he did in the 1930s was for the Soviets. The thing that did not make it a fascist as compared to Speer is that he believed that everybody should be treated by the architect with dignity. And for example, at the Villa Savoie, which I mentioned, not only the villa does not look like a car, but there is a house of the gardener, which is more simple, etc., but exquisitely designed, one of the things I believe about aesthetics is that actually every human being is entitled to architectural dignity, and that it should be one of the tasks of the architect. I'm done. I did it.
It's me.
Well, yeah.
Who designed these chairs?
Luckily, we don't know.
Not one of you. Yeah, but
Why did you say that?
we're not comfortable.
That'd be good to
Yeah.
know.
Anyway, to go back to your query, I'm not particularly comfortable in dealing with the terms of politics and ideology because I am an old man, and when I was a student, we still were indoctrinated in my country, as in other countries, into thinking, which was evidently an ideological premise, that ideology and politics are overstructures. What's the technical term in German? Über something? What would Karl Marx have written? The structure, overstructure, überstructure, meaning superstructure in English. But does anyone remember the original in German?
You know, we're in Estonia, so Karl Marx.
Some may not. We are the same generation, I presume. So you had to study that at school, as I did.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I think apart from this guy, we're pretty much from the same generation.
Anyway, so ideology, ethics, aesthetics. How did you say overstructure? Superstructure. Structure is economics, cost, labor, and I would add, because it is urgent today, the environment. So in my opinion, having a direct confrontation as designer and technologists, as architects and urbanists with economics, costs, labor, the human factor, and the environment is our main inevitable, inescapable challenge. And this is where I think new technologies are our friend, not our foe. Because in each of these areas, we can argue, but not everyone agrees, that technological change can make this predicament easier to fix than it would be otherwise, meaning without technological upgrades. So technology is in this fight our friend, not our foe. Next, in the next query. Now you.
Sure. Maybe I'll pick up on that. So you're obviously both saying that the imperative question of our time as architects is one of sustainability. I mean, you've both stated that at different times this afternoon.
I did not say exactly that. I think architecture has to recognize how important it is. That said, I don't think architects should become sustainable engineers.
Well, I guess this is the point I want to pick up on.
That's exactly, because that I don't believe.
Because I mean, I would say that sustainability is not the most important imperative in terms of something that we should focus architecture on. It's something that we have no choice but to focus architecture on. It's something that's entirely inescapable. However, I don't think it's necessarily interesting enough to drive architecture.
I agree.
And so I think that, I think we're on the same.
Yeah,
we're talking about the same thing, but I think that it can be easily misunderstood when you say sustainability is the most important thing, and therefore
sustainability must. To take a very simple metaphor, my argument is to say sustainability is like the white page, and then you still have to take a pen and write a poem.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
But you need to write it on that page.
Yeah, and I would say. I think I said earlier today that the same of structure. I think all these issues are issues of building science ultimately, and obviously sustainability is the most important one. Although things like structure obviously affect efficiency and therefore sustainability, but these are questions of science, of building science, not of what I think architecture really is, which is part of the humanities.
Among my favorite saying, I mentioned it to some during the break, is since I was trained as an engineer, I can allow in myself. Often say, if you want to save the world, be an engineer. If you want to give meaning to the world, be an architect, which is not the same business.
No.
No.
Was that on purpose?
Yeah, that's called democracy.
It does work. Okay, because like the panel agrees too much, so maybe, I mean, I want to add something about the politics, because I do think that the political is deeply engaged in architecture, even not in a naive way. And for example, I do think the blobs in their apoliticalness were typically neoliberal. They only catered to questions that never had a kind of a social implications. They were about catering towards really big funky museums in Asia or in Dubai, funded by oil money. That whole digital agenda that Mario calls the first digital turn never took on board an actual question about, for example, housing, right? Like housing, 90% of building stock was left out. That is a political decision. That is saying essentially that we are catering for a neoliberal market, or kind of funky shapes are not catering for people to kind of live, but they're catering to marketing cities. And I think there is a political decision in, for example, choosing your kind of battle as an architect. And I think that also relates deeply to aesthetics. I'm throwing a ball to Roland here, for example. I think if you treat every design as a kind of something that is in a way unique and cannot be replicated, for example, along a street or multiplied in an array almost, 40 by 40, there are some aesthetics that are made for multiplication and that are, in a way, not trying to be the kind of the most exciting instance of architecture, but that are generally kind of exciting instances. And that is also kind of a political position. Like basically, how much is the work replicable and multipliable, which embodies the idea of the city, which embodies also a democratic idea that a city is not composed of unique extreme moments of aesthetics, but that there's a general shared aesthetic that we all get, right? Which is the difference between a neoliberal model of difference and a model of difference that we find in historic cities. Like in historic cities, everyone inhabits roughly the same building. If you look at London or Paris, it's a serial repetition of the same moves with subtle differences in parts and certain classes of buildings. But none of these buildings wants to talk about a very, very specific, unique kind of moment of excitement, right? So I think there are very deep political, stitching together all of these questions. I think it's so intrinsically embedded in how we practice as architects. And I think that's a political position,
Gilles,
aesthetic.
Two things.
I wanted
First,
to bully
you're
Roland.
reinventing the modernist project.
I'm a deep modernist. we are
Second, if I was the devil, I take you on top of a hill and I ask you, you have the choice between building a magnificent opera, or you can do 10,000 housing, or not, 500. What will you choose?
10,000 I liked. I would choose 10,000 houses over.
Yeah, that's your baby
That was
Kulas syndrome.
Hannes Meyer would have chosen 10,000.
Hannes Meyer, exactly, but we're back to the modern.
No, but I think that's obviously the accusation, but I don't think it's that dialectic. I think Robin van Acker wrote this manifesto. It's called the Meta-Modernist Manifesto, which is basically saying we are not back in modernism. And obviously, I think the thing that I argue is not back in modernism. It's just trying to say that the questions that we should tackle as architects can be, can go beyond the kind of the funky one-off, right? And that doesn't mean that I want, to be Hannes Meyer, which I think is a very scary, absolutely scary scenario.
Not so bad.
I don't think it's. I mean, look, I think it's a really interesting question, and yeah, I think one of the differences between what you're interested in and what I'm interested in is the difference between the universal and the esoteric, I suspect, and I guess I don't really think about it in those terms, but. In some way, it takes incredible ego to think that what it is that you're offering can be universally spread to every single person. And that, obviously, I guess you're with Corbusier and Mies then. I'm, much more humble. I'm just somebody who has my own personal obsessions. And I'm just, I obsess over something, and I don't really care if nobody has any interest in it at all.
Come on. Don't bullshit too much. You don't really care that nobody cares about what you do. Come on.
No, but there is a curious parallelism which is ubiquitous in our conversations. The idea that in order to be political today, one has to look back at certain period of architectural history. That is nonsense.
No,
I mean,
that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm
Not you,
suggesting
not
I'm
you.
suggesting that actually Gilles' answer is back to some of the illusion of modernity, which believed that it could be an elegant engineering of the planet, and it failed. So I think we've got to find a compromise. You're right. In some ways, it's true that star architecture, doing opera museum and Prada shops when they want really to be popular, is not exactly the definition of a socially oriented architecture. But on the other hand, you know, Hannes Meyer and others led to a dead end. So where are we?
Well, not so long ago as the late 70s, in our schools of architecture, everyone wanted to design school, hospitals, and social housing.
At the Bartlett?
No, when I was a student.
Ah, okay, yeah. Same for me. You know, for us it was. I was even in a communist-ruled school, so we were not allowed to do a tiny theater before year 3. Year 1 and 2 was social housing upon social housing.
First social housing.
And I remember the first time I had a little theater to do. Wow.
No, first schools to educate the class.
I think first I like to make a note. I think we have to be careful to say that the modern project totally failed. Because if we look to the 70s, or if we look for the Second World War, or what was the state of the world after the Second World War, but also worldwide with colonialism, and what the kind of standardization provided, and how that introduced on a large scale the right, the dwelling rights, for instance, the minimum housing.
Agreed.
Of course, we always talk that architecture failed, and architecture believed we could make a new society. Of course, they were part of a new economy, a system of control. But if you look statistically, the rise of health, etc., we cannot just say that the project failed. I think that is a little bit what the left is now somehow disenchanted by, and also worried by, and stops them to think of alternatives and to have a project again, to think of alternatives, what we could then do next. So I think we have to be very critical to the modern project, but I think what it could mean to be modern is not a question we should stop short, but we should again take on board and experiment with alternatives, even if we make mistakes. And that also I read in that good remark is that Le Corbusier was not designing cars as houses, but in fact was trying to find a way to make an architecture of dignity. I think that was a very relevant point. What I thought about politics, I think there are all kinds of politics. I think the architecture is not about what do we vote in parliament. Architecture builds for all kinds of regimes in different styles or at the same times, etc., is also a politics. But I think, as Jacques Rancière, what you refer to, there is also a politics within the architectural knowledge, within the aesthetics itself, what you refer to, or what Bruno Latour says, you establish relations. And those relations are not always neutral. There are differences in power, which are also not bad, but there are all kinds of constructions and value systems which unconsciously are in operation through aesthetics, and they create situations, as you said, and they frame life. And that kind of politics, as Jacques Rancière said, should not be an idea of politics which is about policing, what a lot of architecture is also doing, but should be a kind of politics where it's about dissensus and where people and things which have no voice start to get a voice against the norm. So in fact, I think invite the foreign or the other or the migrant, and the migrant is not only a person, but perhaps also the migrant within us, to start to relate. And that I would call is an idea of the politics within aesthetics, and I think it would be very relevant from my perspective to also see in all these new technological explorations, which I think are very much looked at very formally, what kind of politics they make in fact possible through their technology. Because it is the new, it is a new sense of development ideas and imagination. So I find it a missed opportunity to not address the politics or the aesthetic effect for the people who inhabit, who pass the building, who go in the building, etc., etc. So that was my remark. What do you think about that?
I'm in agreement. Guess what?
I pass.
Pass.
So,
there is a question coming up as soon as we're finished.
Okay, so why don't we?
no, I would have moved to another topic, so let's take the question.
Can we send that up there?
Thank you. One more question. Maybe the architect is the only profession which is prepared within these walls, who is acting according to the wishes of the client. Private entity, legal entity, an officer working on behalf of the society within the legal framework set by the society plus traditions. The question is, and if we are looking for the people who would like to neglect this maybe ideological framework set by all this number of people, maybe like Michael Reynolds in his nice movie, The Garbage Warrior from 2007, he lost his license in the USA because he was neglecting the ideological rules, the legal framework, etc. The question is, do you think that technologies maybe would allow to get out of this circle and maybe to set the profession free of ideological impact like musicians, artists, and other professions can do right now?
No. No, the answer is simple no, for various reasons. One is that architecture is not exactly, if you want to be free, be a writer, a painter, whatever, and be prepared, by the way, also to matter less on certain things. Architecture costs a lot of money. Because it costs a lot of money, because it has legal issues, the right to build, where, etc. It's about power, it's about money, etc. So there is no way you can escape ideology. In addition, I don't think it would be a good thing to allow architects to build whatever they want, wherever they want, with a total disregard for what the client may wish. I think it's a negotiation. A good architect, usually an architect that leaves a legacy, is an architect who is both able up to a certain point to be in sync with the ideology of its time and make a difference at the same time. But architecture plays on the margin. You don't want to play on the margin of the capacity of self-expression. It's better to become an artist in the traditional sense or become a writer, etc. Architecture is an art that plays on the margin between self-expression and the expression of constraints, which are social, political, economic, etc., etc. And that's what makes architecture. Gilles mentioned also the fact that architecture should conform in some ways to the urban fabric. That's another constraint, etc., etc. So you have to accept it, otherwise you're not an architect.
I don't think it's just accepting it. I think that architecture is always at its best when it's rubbing up against those constraints. I think when it operates in a vacuum, I think it's actually tends to repeat. And it's the coming up against a whole series of other constraints makes architecture a whole lot richer.
You could say
so
that.
I don't think it'd be a desire to remove the active design from the profession and from the situation with the client.
Agree.
And technology, since that was part of the question, is an instrument instruments without intentions have no function. So let's not mix and match instrumentality and intentionality. Instruments are tools. Our intentions are what we make with them. So, but in the case of architecture, without tools, architecture does not happen. So,
and in addition, something we almost never speak of in schools, etc., is that architecture is a collective production. You know, most of the big shots, actually, you've got a number of people. So architecture is not produced in the void. It's not a single person. You know, architecture, it's actually a lot of people toiling, usually, and then there is a signature name. But so architecture functions in a very, if you want really to be an individual author, it's better to become an historian. Then you have the problem, of course, that you're desperately trying to find a public, but that's a different thing. But it's a relatively solitary endeavor, you know, and you can say whatever you want. Usually the problem is rather than not that many people care about what you say, but you're perfectly free to do a lot of things that you cannot do as a practicing architect.
And there is another solution, to become, again, artisans. The artisan makes what he or she, historically mostly he, has in mind. You think of a chair,
come on,
you make it.
If you're making a chair or whatever, you usually conform to what the client wants. You know, I don't buy the artisan freedom. Actually, one created architecture as a discipline to gain freedom from craftsmanship.
No, but the artisan makes the chair himself.
You're romanticizing.
Whereas if you are an architect, you cannot make a skyscraper yourself because it's too big. So you need teams of workers to make it happen. The difference is that between a painter who makes a painting with his own hands and a composer who composes a symphony for 250 instruments. Since you cannot play 250 instruments at the same time, you must write it down. And someone has to play it. That's when the symphony happens. It's called notation.
I know it's one of your obsession, but I do think I agree on the notation, etc. I don't agree on the artisan, because if you look historically, artisan was severely constrained by custom.
Yes, but they didn't make blueprints.
Yeah, but come on. It was even more standardized in some ways. I would argue exactly the reverse, that the Renaissance standardization of the order was a way to allow for invention, which you also wrote at some wiser moment of your career.
You were in the jury of my habilitation. So.
No, but come on, you wrote an entire book on license.
Nobody knows that.
Yeah, well, I know.
We went into another topic, so it kind of doesn't fit anymore. But I wouldn't say that the artisan is completely alone either, because the artisan is also part of a culture and a tradition, and there is a knowledge which is shared, and there is a certain relation of transmission of information also, and working with the material and so on. So in a way, you're actually never completely alone. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely impossible that an architect, can be totally detached from society. Like answering to the previous question, that would be like imagining that there's a kind of entity outside of a social context, which actually is not possible, or it would make no sense. And then going back to the political question, perhaps is that is a matter of terminology or meaning, because it's not always that what we mean by political, meaning that you take party or you're aligned with a certain political ideology only, but as it was mentioned earlier, also being political also means being in a certain position, in a context. So in that sense, so having access or not access or being concerned about the environment is already a political act. So in that sense, it's not that much about right or left. That would be a bit of a simplification, let's say. Or even, we've been also discussing earlier about data. Laura Corrigan, for instance, or Felix Stalder are actually arguing that data is never neutral either. Like data is always collected with a particular device, with a particular purpose, and is actually repurposed to
with a kind of goal and as processed with a particular goal. So in that sense, also data falls into this kind of social political category. It's never, there's nothing completely neutral in that sense. So I think taking a position is just necessary. It's not like an enemy. Going back to that way, is what it is, right?
An historian could have told you that there is no such thing as raw data, because data is always pre-formatted in one way or another.
No, I just wanted to kind of intervene in the discussion in between you two just a few minutes ago when you mentioned the role of the artisan and the potential for architects to develop in some sort of professional that is also able to actually manufacture somehow through, of course, like automation, robotics, and reimagining that connection. And I just wanted to say that actually I noticed that recently there have been like quite a few practices that have been working in that direction. I mean, I would say that Roland work somehow is also part of this, when you kind of fabricate and you're so deep into like developing the actual technology and possibly building part of it within the factories, within the lab at the university and so on. And I know people that have been kind of buying robots to transfer them on site and build parts, and just in order possibly to kind of develop to lower cost. Generally, this happened quite a lot. I've seen it around. So I mean, I would argue that actually that's something that it is already happening somehow.
But I think there's an important difference there between whether it's in the aid of design or it's about fabrication. I mean, I'm trying to get out of the fabrication business. Like, I think it's and I was very late to. I mean, I come from a background of algorithmic work. I saw a lot of my colleagues go into robotics, and I just, I was very resistant for a long time because I thought that this is not the problem for architects. Until I got too frustrated about not being able to build, and then decided I would just I'd give in and I would figure out ways of building. But I think the problem is that every tool, whether it's a digital tool or a pen or a robot, dramatically affects what it is that you can and do design. And there are people, and I've thought about this a lot, do I set up a factory and become a builder? Do I set up a factory full of robots and start building my own projects? But then, of course, you realize that even though a robot is an incredibly versatile tool in the way that laptop's a fairly versatile tool, it still is going to dictate what it is that you do design. And I guess I've realized that the real benefit of having your hands on tools is that you can develop ways of making and designing simultaneously in a way that have feedback. And I think that's when work gets tremendously interesting. But if you become the construction company yourself, then you're just going to lock into a certain way of working, and then you're just going to repeat that. And so I think that's an incredibly dangerous thing as well.
Hold on. By the way, historically, most of the people who've tried to do that...
They go bankrupt.
They get bankrupt. Prouvé, many others. It doesn't work. Now, I wanted to go back to the artisan because
you're claiming...
I'm just fed up, to be honest, with the mythology of the artisan. First of all, because artisan is not about freedom. It's about received model. It's about following tradition. And 99% of what an artisan does is that. And you can actually trace both the birth of the modern architect and the modern engineer as trying to free invention from craftsmanship. So I'm always surprised. And by the way, speaking of the Gothic, now we know that the Gothic was not this free spirit of everybody doing his little lancet arch, etc., that it was super hierarchical, that it was actually a cathedral was a business enterprise, because the biggest question was actually not flying buttresses but money, etc., and that you had the hierarchy, etc. So I think in some ways, let's not forget that the modern world and the modern technology did free us. So the Ruskinian craftsman only existed in Ruskin Head.
I mean, I want to add something.
Hold on.
Okay.
We are missing the point. The point is that designers need an act of design to convey their ideas to someone else who will make that ideas convert into reality. Yeah, whereas the artisan doesn't use blueprint. Nobody claims that the artisan can invent outside of society. We know how artisans were trained and how they were constrained, just like everyone else. The significant difference is that the artisan is not a designer in the sense that he does not use notation to tell other people how to materialize his ideas. This is the difference between the artisan who does not design and the designer who does not build.
Yeah, it's a
and
kind
the
of
position you
principle
were
of
arguing
incertitude.
is that of the designer who goes back to using his own tools. And so the separation between design and making is indeed being reduced by digitality. Or it was 15 years ago.
It's totally. I mean, there is that reduction, but it's not. But I'm in a situation where I still need notation because I want to build larger things, and I don't want to build them myself. And so, even though you might take on some of the understanding of the artisan in terms of the way you might start to understand the relationship between design and fabrication, you still need a way of communicating it to somebody else to construct.
Exactly.
I'm wondering if you're not a
machine.
misplaced Derridian without even realizing it, because you have a kind of a position between the authenticity of the gesture, which would not be dependent upon notation, and the drama of notation as a kind of estrangement from the authenticity of the relation to matter, etc. Reminds me strangely of Derrida's grammatology, the drama of speech versus writing. So in some ways you hate writing.
No, it's an Heideggerian point. Because
Yeah, I know. No, not Heidegger, please.
I want to throw a few more logs on the fire of the artisan. So, I mean, I would also argue that actually if you use digital machines, especially if you don't do subtractive methods, but you actually do additive methods, it's not a very artisanal way of working. It's just merely using a machine to organize bits and pieces, which has nothing to do, it's directly like you don't have a blueprint, but it's directly your idea that gets translated to a series of instructions where you place material. It has nothing to do with the gesture, has nothing to do. So I think the term artisan is very difficult there because the term artisan implies this kind of gestural, crafty thing. And I'm also allergic to artisan. The term, it's folk for me, it's non-intellectual. It's very, very difficult. And that connects in, which is interesting, again, back to politics. So essentially, this kind of story of digital craft, which has been kind of lingering around in this circle, also comes in a way from a certain moment in Silicon Valley where people were thinking that actually through access to tools, which is a counterculture phenomena, that basically through access to tools you enable people to become autonomous and start their own companies. So the whole idea of the Fab Lab is like, look, we don't need to change the structures of society, just give people access to tools. We will give every city a little Fab Lab with a laser cutter, a drill, a 3D printer, and then people who are very poor and badly educated don't have a job. They go to the Fab Lab, they get access to tools, and they magically start a company, right?
Yeah, and by the way, they lose their job because of fabrication.
Which is a deeply libertarian American ideology. And
Or
Evgeny Morozov
neoliberal.
wrote about
You
it.
could argue that it's also perfectly compatible with a neoliberal project.
Yeah, I was just doing that. Yes,
Yeah.
It's completely, deeply libertarian.
It's highly problematic because I've really been struck in digital fabrication by how little thought have been devoted very often to the worker. Actually, I was glad to have finally a carpenter or something, as if buildings. And this is where, by the way, we're a little bit still walking on the head, because if you look around the world is still full of people who built buildings. So, and there is very little thought, because Ruskin has been, the paradox of the Ruskinianism of the digital is that it's an excuse not to think of the status of the worker today.
Yeah, but in a vast historical perspective, the worker we have in mind is a robot.
No,
So
I don't agree at all. I don't. I'm there
Wait
again
and
a
see.
little
Wait
bit.
and see.
No, not wait and see.
Wait and
I'm
see.
ready to bet.
And the robot, the term means robot, when the term was invented in 1922 or something, in Czech means slave labor.
What
So we are
an
talking-
enthralling perspective.
Well, slave labor means
means
the
work.
opposite of wage labor. Robots don't go on strike.
What I
They
believe
don't
is
have
that
wages.
with artificial intelligence, first robots will go on strike. You know, I wrote that piece about freeing the robots because I do think that, you know, it makes me very nervous because usually we conceive machine as a way to reconceive our status as humans. And it makes me very nervous that, you know, as an ideal, we are having slave machines. As a coincidence, I think it's a good excuse usually to go on with enslaving large swath of the population.
Better to have as slaves machines than to have as slaves
That's what entrepreneurs have been
humans.
saying since the first industrial revolution, and that was a powerful incentive toward creating the proletarian class.
Well, you know how Frederick Taylor, the guy who invented Taylorism in 1911, how he defined the worker at a moving assembly line? He called it an automaton.
Yeah,
A gorilla with the intelligence of an ox. This is the human worker, which we are not trying to perpetuate.
But also, Antoine, like I disagree actually here now.
Yeah,
Like,
good,
I mean, like the
good.
slave worker. I mean, like the whole point is that we automate all labor. That's beyond any
Yes.
doubt. That's what humanity is striving to do. You
We don't
automate
want
all
to
labor so that you can become
Yeah, but
human.
I think
Yes.
where it's
The only
tricky-
problem, no, the only
where
problem
it's
is like
tricky-
the only problem is the political system it's embedded in.
Not only
but
because
without the
let's
first
be
industrial revolution,
futuristic for once.
Nobody
If you
wants to be a
imagine that
miner.
machines will become intelligent, you know, I think one of the biggest problems we're going to have in the decades to come that we're beginning to see with autonomous car, even if we're not going to see that many of them by the end, but what are the right of a semi-intelligent machine? Are they higher than a cat? Lower than the cat? You know, today, if you kill a cat with cruelty in France, you go to jail.
Good.
And, you know, it's a recent evolution, by the way. So does it mean that in 30 years from now, and you see that now in science fiction movie, if you behave very badly towards a robot, a gentle robot, should you be punished, not punished, etc.? I think, but I'm the most futuristic in that respect, but I do believe that actually, you know, if we conceive of machines only as slaves, while machines are becoming intelligent, we're going to run into trouble.
But, I mean, like just to finish the point, without the first industrial revolution, you would have no labor rights, no women rights, you would have no
agree.
rights, right? And it's just like to follow, again, like good old Marx, like you just accelerate it to the point that production becomes so efficient that it doesn't require capital anymore,
Well,
which is the
someone's
digital,
claiming
right?
that.
Like the whole point of the digital is that
That's what
production
we've seen
is
so far.
almost for free, and the only problem is that we allow big monopolies to capitalize on free production, and we don't...
But
We
in-
cannot compete with them. But like to organize Uber doesn't actually cost a lot of money, right? It's
Even-
almost for free.
Even
The only problem is that we
independently-
don't own
Talk
it
to
as
the
people.
driver.
Even independently from political and ideological considerations, from a simple human vantage point, I don't see any reason why we should not abolish the work of miners in a coal mine. It's a shitty job. And if machines can do that, so much the better. And there are so many the workers at the moving assembly line who was theorized as an automaton with the intelligence of an ox. Nobody wants to do that job. The job of a bricklayer, the job of a
That said,
bricklayer is a
Taylor
shitty
was
job.
much more ambiguous because Taylor was actually a skilled politician. And, you know, Taylor's scientific management was based on a negotiation with workers that they would no longer. So he wrote that.
I
but
quoted
actually
him verbatim. This is
Yeah, I know.
verbatim what he said.
But actually, Taylor himself worked on the shop floor, and he knew very well that actually, for example, the workers did not give full productivity because they were not stupid.
Yes, but himself-
So the whole scientific management
You know
is a
what he
much
did?
more subtle enterprise.
He was a tennis player. That's what he
But so, Mauro, around mining.
he was a tennis player. A champion, number 2.
Australia is kind of fairly, we waste our opportunities in Australia. And so our biggest industry is mining. And miners are actually the highest paid people per category in Australia. And so you would think that the greatest wealth in terms of salary is in the centre of the cities, but it's actually not. It's in these parts of Australia where nobody live except the fly-in, fly-out miners.
Thank you.
Now,
I couldn't have imagined
but
this
what's
one.
happening, but also because we have such high labour costs in Australia, we're automating everything in mines. So now we have these massive mines which produce incredible wealth, and there's virtually nobody who are working there. It's all done by robots.
Good.
Now, so all the wealth that was getting transferred to these people who work these dirty jobs who are overpaid in mines, you know, if you really want to make money in Australia, become a mine truck driver. That's where all the money is. They no longer get the money because they're all robots, all the trucks.
That's because you vote for the wrong party.
So what's happened now, of course, is that it's actually foreign, massive multinational companies who are extracting all the wealth. So I'm not sure that the automation of shitty jobs necessarily is better for the people.
Actually, it suppresses also
Would they
somewhat
like
of a- it's a-
It's just a political question. These machines are good. They prevent people from dying in mines.
Yes,
right?
yes. Nobody likes to die in a mine.
you know,
That's naive. It's very naive.
have you read Carbon Democracy? Because Mitchell, in this book, argues that actually the mines were instrumental in fostering social progress for a very
Yes, but the
simple
miners
reason,
died.
because people could go on strike.
But
And
they
if you
also
look at the
died.
great social progress of the late 19th century, it's people on strike. Robots don't strike. The problem then is that you have the unbridled domination of capital, and that's it.
No, but that's
It's
just
a
capital
real
owns the
issue.
robots.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
We
Who owns the
have
robots?
a remark here coming into the situation.
Yeah, sorry, just absolutely fascinating discussion that you have about sort of the specialization of work and using robots for implementation in different work fields that you apparently foresee. I also really like those comments about artificial intelligence. Saying that if you equip a machine with an intelligence, at some moments you obviously have to give them as an animated entity some rights in order to participate. I think you're both right, just from my personal
I
view. With
hate
all
to be
respect,
right with him.
You're both right and
You
you're
have to
both
choose.
wrong. No, sorry, I think
That's the
you're both
best.
right and both wrong in the sense
Okay,
that
if we're both wrong, it's
we are
already more fun.
discussing it's sort of the robots as a sort of specialized entity. So we've taken everything, we've taken the design through computational design, we've taken digital fabrication and sort of socialized fabrication for a larger entity, make that available to the masses with the Fab Lab. That was a conversation. We've been talking about automated construction through robotics, which supposedly is going to help the building industry. And we've begun to talk about collaborative robotics in a sense that we actually do have a machine, rather less intelligent or not, a counterpart that supports work in a sort of larger field. And actually what we are looking at is not specialized work, but these robots, they have found implementation in the largest sense and in the largest scenarios. So most architecture schools, or an increasing number of architecture schools, maybe I should phrase it like that, actually do have robots as design elements, experimentation elements, so that we're able to recreate materiality and work processes, etc. Where I'm driving with all of that is basically, we're talking about digital reality. So we are fundamentally talking about a reality that's based on algorithms. And I can't keep but struggle with the idea that Hariri has put out there, and some people may have read Homo Deus, where the human actually has become an algorithm, or will become increasingly an algorithm in itself. So in a way, what we're fighting for here is a distinction between us and them, between the machines and the humans. But I think we're actually much closer to a hybridization of our intellectual capacities with these machines that we are creating. And the way that they're intellectually and humanistically impacting on our very being, in the way that we understand ourselves as humans. So we're not so far that it's not going to be us and them. It's not going to be, we are already so much more technologized than we were not so long ago.
That's exactly why I want still humans in a lot of jobs. I think we need a new equilibrium. That's what I believe, because actually, yes, we're going to be facing with machines which may not be intelligent in the sense we give it, but which make decision in our society.
Are we calculating ourselves out of the equation is one question, and my second question would be, what do you see for 2050? What's going to be our reality?
Oh, the same but worse. Let's be optimistic. I think honestly that robots are not the biggest problem facing mankind. Honestly, first of all, because we're 9 billions. So whatever we do, there will be still entire swath of continents with cheap labor for a number of things, Because there again, we talk about robotization, but China is full of Taylorian workers. So let's not forget the reality, etc. So I think, the sad truth is that humans are very often cheaper than machines. So, and if one day really humans were more expensive than machine, we would have made tremendous progress. But I don't think we're there. So I'm probably, the big difference with Mario is that you probably have a tendency to see the glass half full or half empty or whatever. And I'm very skeptical, for example, about, what's his name, Rifkin kind of prediction. Honestly, I'm extremely skeptical of that, because if you look at the state of the world, you have rather rising inequality. A lot of people, speaking of shitty jobs are still multiplying around the world, etc. So I'm not overly optimistic, to be honest. I'm reasonably optimistic that if by 2050 we had really begun to realize the extent of the problem, that would be already great. That would be my take. If in 2050 you no longer had climate negationists, if the fact that inequality... no, but let's be reasonable. I think 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we're not going to make it. So it's going to be tough. If by 2050 social inequality was finally seen as what it is, that's to say actually an obstacle to progress, instead of believing that it's actually in a Darwinian way, the best take over the poor, the less talented, I think we would have made progress. If architects by 2050 had realized a number of basic things also about their discipline, I think I would be happy too.
Your turn to answer.
To answer that?
Yeah. It was a question to 3 of us.
You have one great advantage on us, or a disadvantage. You'll still be there in 2050, which are more dubious for us.
On the long term,
we're hoping, but, chances are so-so.
On the long term, we are all dead.
Well, in 2050, you and I, if we're still there, we'll be very, very old.
I'm going to pass. I'm going to leave this to you.
Me too.
Hybrids between computers and humans, as we know, are predicted to be in 8 years by Ray Kurzweil. We, of course, might think that
so the singularity was supposed to happen in the early, he's been moving up the singularity.
No, he brought it down. He said 2030, now it's 2028. And unfortunately, the guy has track record something like 80 to 90% of being accurate in technology. That makes me a pessimist.
Oh, I'm not at all believing in Kurzweil. I think Kurzweil was invented, thanks God, to prove that social sciences are still useful. Because I've never seen such a heap of absurdities. So I think, frankly, the
Why don't you look at market capitalization of...
Yeah, that I'm ready to believe. But, us uploading ourselves in machine, etc., I think is completely underestimating a lot of things. By the way, the singularity a few years ago was actually in the early 2020. He moved it up, and now he may be moving it down again. But the truth is, I've never seen, the singularity is one of the craziest books I've seen.
So, in terms of Kurzweil, I want to try and bring this back to a question I've been dying to ask Mario. And that's something about, so Kurzweil is interested, what he's trying to do is extrapolate through a particular exponential curve to talk about the way, that exponential curve can't reach an asymptote. It's impossible to...
Why?
About
Why?
production. Simply about production, because production can't be increased to an infinite point. So in terms of economic growth...
you mean a vertical asymptote?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
Because
Can never happen. So what it is, it's a conceptual... it's a conceptual problem. But what he's doing is he is extrapolating out of surface information, out of big data, effectively. Mm-hmm. To use another term. So I guess my question for Mario is, is around this function to list question, which is sort of like the question of like model to big data. And I think the problem with Kurzweil is that he's not interested in the underlying model of the world. He's interested in extrapolating data. And you are relating calculus to the function. But of course, all of the lists you're talking about are generated through functions. Like the material in the list is created through functions, typically through algorithmic functions. So I guess I get very worried when people talk about big data and when people talk about the way you talk about the list, because I see it as like a total rejection of trying to understand reality. Architects don't need to understand reality because we just make things. We don't need to understand what's actually there. I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but the thing is, what we do need to do is we need to understand what it is the model that we use to create those things. So I think if we completely reject the function and embrace the list, then I think we're going to have the same problems that Kurzweil has.
You know, when I was young, I studied mathematics. And in mathematics, you take an unusual amount of time to do things which had no practical impact, which was to demonstrate that a differential equation had locally a solution. We did not provide you any idea really about how the solution looked, but enabled you to understand in depth the structure of the differential equation. Mm-hmm. This is almost gone now in engineering school, etc., because actually you use a machine to just calculate the solution to the differential equation. So it's probably, I think the way I understood that, it's probably substituting to a structural understanding of mathematical problems. I think your example of the function is wrong, by the way, but it's true that there is a shift from understanding to computing. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's a fundamental problem for humans so far. Except if actually what we believe we understood was just computing, which is another possibility.
Let's make a proposal. Mm-hmm. It goes to the dean up there. Let's meet in 8 years here. The same people, the same keynotes, okay. and look at the world, space and digital reality 2.0, let's say.
Can we make it in 4 years?
We don't know whether Ray Kurzweil has been uploaded yet, but 28, of course we can come before that.
8 years.
So please, Dean, have it in mind that in 8 years, in September 11th, we are going to have a conference to discuss it again. But before that, there is a comment coming.
Oh, okay, so... But we should come with scuba divers. You would be underwater, right?
We'll see.
I felt a little bit
they
guilty
make a dam on the Baltic.
We were discussing about this issue with craftsmen and handcraft and when will everything be digitized. And I think a nice summing up position is that we don't have to think about this moment when will machines take over. But I think it was 12 years ago when this Second Life internet platform came up and everybody was a little bit afraid that nobody will leave the house anymore because everything will happen in Second Life. But to be honest, if we just have to take away all batteries from a building site and then we will see how connected we are already. So the excavator won't work anymore because the guy who handles the excavator is already a robot in some kind of course, I don't know how far we are, but some plans are already on the iPad. And of course, the excavator itself is a robot for the person himself. So I don't think that we have to search that far in the future. When will everything be digitized? Just take away my mobile phone and I won't be able to come to my hotel today back again. So I think we don't have to look so far in the future, but we have to be... Yeah, but not with Uber, I think, or my credit card. So I think we can already look in the current moment and think about what hybrids we are already developing. Mm-hmm. Thinking of the carpenter and the architect and the craftsperson. Yep.
Can I add a note on an unrelated topic?
Yes.
Yes.
Based on today's presentation, the number of quotations, the topic which was top on the list of citations, was not politics, it was not technology, it was timber. By number of quotations, timber is top of the list. Does it mean something? Timber in very different connotations. Your timber is different from his timber, but it was still timber.
Yeah. They believed they were doing function and they were doing lists.
It looks like we've come to the end of the panel, unless there is one more question. And there is. But this will be the last question for this year's conference.
Hi. I have a question, yes. So for me, there's a lot of talk about technology, and I'm a master's student here, and like for most students, we work through references. So if I can consider you guys somewhat visionaries in your field of work, what is the references which you use? And do you think that there is also, especially I think that one topic which was not really mentioned today was social media. And do you think that, for example, we are influenced by references in today's world also? And does that become also part of technology which also affects us in the future? Yeah.
I don't use social media, so I cannot answer.
I think social media is part today of this kind of extended self. You know, you manage it with shift. For example, the shift from Facebook to Instagram, etc. It's quite striking how Facebook has become a kind of older generation thing, etc., etc. But it's clear that it's part of the thing. Actually, I didn't mention it today, but I very often mention it because I think it's a very fundamental. Where I'm a bit also skeptical about Kurzweil is, you know, the scheme goes with the idea that we would be reasonable by the time of the singularity. I think social networks have demonstrated that actually with all these magnificent tools, we can be even more stupid than we were without them. So there is hope for the worst.
Thank you. With that optimistic note, we should conclude this panel. Thank you very much, all the presenters.